Hello everyone, today we talk about the armies of Antigonid Macedon. So it's essentially an introductory video about the organization of the Macedonian army between 276 and 168 BC. So we're gonna actually skip the whole story of the Antigonid dynasty proper. This is not gonna be a story of the family and of the strictly military history of those times. I will discuss that in detail, battle by battle, in other videos. This is not gonna be a video on the Macedonian Phalanx proper either. I will definitely talk about that, but it will also essentially stick to the organization proper. So no battle, chiefly the organics and how, and let's say a bit of hierarchy and how these armies were practically put together. So a bit of background is however necessary, because this is the history of this Antigonid dynasty that took its name from Antigonus Monophthalmos. It was one of the commanders of Alexander the Great. So today we're gonna start the story from the moment in which the Antigonids basically rise to the throne of Macedon in itself, which basically happened in 277-76 BC under Antigonus Gonata, who basically succeeded his father Demetrius Poliorcetes, that had been, by the way, being captured at the time. That's also another great figure that it's been one of the great defeated in history. Also, his nickname is kind of a joke to tell that he was most a besieger and not a conqueror of cities, because that's however where in fact what most of the term Poliorcetic actually owes to, because he was one of the first great military engineers of the time. And that's what he was nicknamed that way. He built a great deal of siege equipment of massive dimensions as well, sometimes, and that, however, didn't make him accomplish a great deal, but still being recognized as the peak of Hellenistic military engineering. And you know that basically it was these Hellenistic states that pioneered eventually the most of, especially, for instance, siege engines. The Trojan catapults, for instance, is something you start finding on a regular base, not just in an experimental form, in the armies of Macedon in itself, since the times of Philip II, so much earlier than this, and that eventually were developed and later absorbed also by other civilizations like the one of the Cartogenians and of the Romans. And today we're not gonna tell the truth a big deal about that, but just for framing the Antigonid Macedon into this broader Hellenistic military culture that gave so much in those times, and was by those times still the most advanced eventually, and that only the Romans were eventually able to vanquish. I know that this is a very hotly, let's say, debated topic in many ways, and I promise that on my channel, because I'm quite keen on the subject. I think that out there, this clash, for instance, between the Romans and the Macedonian, or better, the Romans and the Hellenistic phalanxes, say it in broader terms, is a very hotly debated topic, but also absolutely miscomprehended in many ways, especially from the strictly military point of view. There is a lot of mechanicism, a lot of theologism. People read sources without having a proper criticism of the peculiar, even without knowing the language most of the times. So even certain terms are misinterpreted, or at least they are translated in a very superficial way, and they can be. And you can see that actually even many prominent historians have committed these mistakes. So maybe you open a book and you find mistakes, pretty serious mistakes, that derived from wrong translation, and eventually is taken in that fashion by other scholars that just copy each other, and they form up a mess. Like, I don't know, one of the major, probably the most idiotic thing in absolute terms is the Carthaginian pikemen. The fact that Carthaginians copied the Macedonian phalanx. Well, yeah, because they were Hellenistic, right, in culture. Well, that has nothing to do with that. The Carthaginians never fielded Macedonian-styled phalanxes, but since Connolly once mistranslated a term, well, everybody from now on has just copied, stuck on him, and well, today we know it. We know that it's false, but it just takes actually to take a good history book, a good study, or even just it takes to know how to translate from ancient Greek, for instance, to know that such mistakes are colossal, and I think that every historian who commits them, well, he can be forgiven, but you're probably not going to give him much credit in this sense. So, but besides this vent, that is definitely a we will have time to discuss that. I promise. But let's stick to Macedon now. So basically, when Antigonus Gonatas, when he rose up into Macedon, he had actually very few resources. The Antigonid army there practically did not exist as such. There were a few mercenaries that were essentially making up the garrisons of Greece, and not much else. And especially that was a pretty tough moment for Macedon because of the Galatian invasion. So this is the time in 280 BC into which the Gauls, these Celtic populations, migrated from Central Europe along the Danube and reaching into the Balkans, and essentially invading Greece, making this essentially pillaging the territory and throwing the local population into chaos. And this was a pretty serious issue because the same Antigonid dynasty was struggling for survival, and there were lots of competitors. Basically, with the Battle of Ipsus of 301 BC in Phrygia, the Antigonids had been radically defeated. Antigonus Monophthalmus had been killed himself. So progressively, the Antigonids that had ruled over large areas of the Near East were eventually left space to the Seleucids, and were actually progressively stamped and kicked away, we can say, into the Balkans proper, into Macedon. At this time, the Attalids were their enemies. The Lysimachean domains also were against them. Epirus was against them, and Egypt was against. So this was a very tough. It was difficult even for the enemies of the Antigonids to actually make a concerted effort, also because they hated each other as well, and they just wanted to. They were still thinking essentially after recovering the whole territory that had encompassed Alexander's conquests. This time, actually, Pyrrhus, that is also dealing here pretty closely with Macedon, basically managing even at a certain moment to seize the kingdom and overthrowing temporarily the Antigonids. he was just conceiving those lands as well as the ones in Italy and Sicily just as the base for a further for a further expansion into the east that had theoretically had to make him reacquire Alexander's empire up to India. So that's the strategic horizons on which these rulers were set. Then eventually in the mid-30s, things kind of settled down in this 3rd century BC. There were certain equilibriums that were basically set between these powers, and therefore the successor states eventually formed up in the fashion that we know. And even the Antagonids got this firm, stable dominion over Macedon that had been, in fact, the place of origin of all these Macedonian, say, not dynasties proper, because most of these guys rose from, there were smaller dynasties of aristocrats as well, but these now were ruling as monarchs, as with Philip's II line that had basically gone. And the excuse me, I drink a little. So Antigonus Gonatas actually rose to power by crushing a branch of the Celtic invaders at the Battle of Lysimachaia. And this made him actually acquiring formally the Macedonian throne, because the Macedonian population also was pretty suspicious also of these dynasts. They had their own local interests, and were also, there was this general at the time political instability due to war, and also it was difficult even to seize the throne in the first place. And when Antigonus, in fact, rose to the throne, he didn't really call out the Macedonian, say, national army. At this point, Macedon was depopulated and then devastated by an invasion, so all the ensuing economic crisis and other effects you can imagine. So calling up the army would have really make the loyalty to the new king sink pretty low, and the people was not, in fact, required this big effort. By the way, today we won't be talking about it. I think I will make another video, but I will explain one day how actually expensive it was to raise a phalanx at that time. It was something extremely expensive. The equipment was extremely, it all required a lot of resources, a lot of work. So it was something that could be done only in certain moments. As a matter of fact, only the major successor states could actually rise a phalanx. If you take Pergamon, for instance, that was it was a hell of a power, but it was mostly revolving. It was too small as a dominion, territorially speaking, to allow the creation of a properly phalangite army, so that the Attalids mostly relied on just local mercenaries and or city contingents and other allies and all. But even in the larger successor state, like Macedon, like the Seleucid Empire especially, and Ptolemaic Egypt, even rising a phalanx was a pretty big enterprise. It was a huge cost, and it was usually something rare to do, especially at this time. As you see it now, we have just seen it in Macedon. All these wars that had been ravaging the the remains, say, of Alexander's empire also brought a pretty heavy toll. There is this first phase after the death of Alexander, into which these successors really fought extensively with all the resources that had been accumulated by Alexander, but eventually these went also exhausted. And that's when, in fact, the successors they kind of cool down a little. They try to have to build up a better organization in the territories where they managed to control. So there is a sort of sedentarization and the following construction of a state, basically. So every of these successor states had its own characteristics that dictated even the military culture that and traditions that they had. So now we will see it in the case of the Antigonids of Macedon. So at this point, Antigonus Gonatas, what does he do? He decides to just hire mercenaries. And he had these Hellenic mercenaries already, but those weren't enough, so he begins to hire actually pretty large numbers of Celts. So these Gauls that had invaded Greece were still eligible for actually fighting for the same Hellenistic powers. And this is a moment in which the Macedonian army sees a huge quantity of such warriors employed. So these were readily available at that point. They were fierce and also relatively cheap. So the Celts were coming, especially these ones of the Danube, were coming from relatively very primitive areas of Europe, and they were attracted by gold. Celts, in this sense, were all around the Mediterranean at this time. You can find them as far as Egypt, because they were these. It happens all the time. There is a wild, fierce, warlike population that inhabits at the margins of the civilized world that is attracted by the wealth of the civilized world. So either it invades it, or they start being used as soldiers, or both, as a matter of fact. So by 273 BC, however, the first Macedonian phalanges, or at least I'm not sure whether there were actually was the actual phalanx, but I think so. However, there were also other units, including cavalry and other more even infantry troops that were more probably mobile than the phalanx, but there were Macedonians at this point. So he progressively that is kind of obvious. It's there is a commitment in recruiting people who are if they are well off enough to participate to a military expedition that come from your from within your boundaries, okay, so from your, and that have even a sort of interest to participate to such wars, because eventually they're gonna benefit of the victories if they will occur. But seemingly this was not the case, because the situation was messed up enough to see actually the same Macedonians, the Antigonid army, deserting to Pyrrhus, king of Epirus. And this is a pretty good lesson, because in historical terms, because while the Macedonians basically deserted to the enemy, the Galatian mercenaries instead fought and died till the last man. So never think in history that the idea of the mercenary that is a sort of jerk that abandons you in the worst imaginable moments is a romantic myth of the 19th century. where national armies were being emphasized as the new form of warfare, essentially, with a nation state, and therefore the idea of the mercenary that sells his services to the best offerer was considered as a negative symbol, ideologically speaking. And indeed, historically speaking, mercenaries might have been unreliable. But if you look at, in fact, even at these, let's say, national contingents, you realize that if those could be as unreliable as the mercenaries, practically. Chiefly, and especially if these guys were paid. This is the point. If you are a soldier, wherever you are still probably doing it for the money. So it doesn't matter here if you are a Macedonian raised in Macedon. There might be lots of political or social economical reasons that make you wanna, say, betray the guy you're under with, which doesn't mean that you don't love your homeland. It simply means that maybe you think that for your homeland other choices are better. So the fact that these were soldiers was also pretty meaningful, because at this point, surely I think that Pyrrhus was wealthier than Antigonus Gonatas. I could be wrong, but at least Pyrrhus was more successful at this point, more powerful. So that really means a lot. You see that pretty often, even in the same successor, in the other successor states, conflicts. There could be phalanges that could pass from one side to another as well. I think we have only one account that tells us about the existence of mercenary phalanges. That is something pretty weird and rare, because phalanges is not something you find, as military bands out there. As we were saying before, the phalanx is something you need really a statal structure to recruit, to upkeep, and therefore this usually that's the only exception there is in the Hellenistic world in this sense. But let's say that the Galatians in this occasion proved to be more faithful than the same Macedonian phalanges, and were more committed than them. So as long as someone paid them, they were willing to die, and obviously there were also other interests. It's not that these Celts were they weren't aware of what the conditions were, but evidently there was also other political interests for them to stick to Antigonus at that point. So as we were saying before, Pyrrhus manages even to briefly retake control of Macedon, and even though Gonatas mercenaries eventually even played a part in the fighting that brought even to the death of Pyrrhus himself. So at this point, with the Epirot power basically into decline, Macedon, the Antigonid dynasty is able to secure Macedon proper. Pyrrhus, basically, I think the Pyrrhus dynasty kind of the monarchy was kept for a short time, but eventually Epirus fragmented into a league of cities and of tribes that was essentially what you find until the Roman conquest. So that wasn't practically a big deal of a problem anymore. And the major power into the Balkanic and the southern Balkans is Macedon at this point. That is going to be structured by the Antagonids as a solid monarchy. So even with a military system that really worked well enough to provide some of the largest armies, even of the successor states, to field the phalanx once again, and especially to try to expand southwards towards Greece, because that was pretty wealthy area where there were lots of cities. So these Hellenistic monarchs were mostly interested not much in manpower that they could easily find on their own, given the concept of the phalanx, which is not anymore the one of a citizenry, but rather the one of a mercenary army. So this is, but the Hellenistic warfare is very different from the classical one. We will have a way to explain it, but it's pretty evident. I mean, in classical warfare, the Greek city-states fielded phalanxes that were aside different from obviously the ones in technical terms to the ones that came later, the ones of pikemen, but were bodies of citizens. There was even there progressively a transformation with a rise of mercenaries and all, but that had been mostly the standard classical army. In Hellenistic times, these armies are mostly all of mercenaries, and the guys were recruited even to be part of the phalanx. Were usually local, they were subjects more than citizens, if we want to tell it all, and there were actually bands of even desperates, because they didn't have to provide their own equipment, they just were paid and equipped by the state, so even military career was something profitable as long as the military, the victories came. So with loot and all. This is a bit what happens also in the Roman army. The Roman army initially was an army of citizens that had to provide their own equipment, just like the Greek classical citizen, peasant, soldier, say. And then eventually with the Marian reform, and that was a censual army. So with Marian reform, the census is taken out, and everyone, as long as he was a Roman citizen, doesn't matter whether they usually were proletarians at that point, they would have been equipped by the state. So at this time, actually, the Romans still functioned well. While the Hellenistic still functioned as a citizen army, let's say. Of militia even, because they weren't really professional at this point, while the Hellenistic armies at this point were properly armies of professionals, of people who were paid to carry out essentially the military service. And I don't know why I stress this now, but it's important because it's also a matter of society. For instance, because of this, and this is paradoxical, we are much better documented on the classical Greek armies than the Hellenistic successors ones. Simply because at the time of classical Greece, there were citizens that were also relatively well off to write the story of their motherland. Under the successor states, instead, we have less sources because the guys who participated to those armies were a bunch of analphabet peasants who just joined the army for loot and or better, just received also the pay in some measure. But looting was, however, the major form of revenue for these people, who were behaving essentially as, in this sense, as mercenaries. They didn't write down things, but they didn't tell us many details, and that's why we don't know this excessively much, for instance, about even how the phalanx worked, and why there is a lot of speculation involved and too much fantasy sometimes even used to describe it, for the anxiety of explaining how it really was, that unfortunately we don't know. Excuse me, I drink a little once again. So at this point, the Macedonian, the Antigonid Macedonian dynasty would rule until basically Rome deposed the king Perseus in 168 BC after the defeat of Pydna. So Antigonus Gonatas actually reigned for a pretty long time, from 276 to 239 BC. And here there is a bit of a problem in terms of what his army actually was composed. Because of the aforementioned reasons, but the fact that we don't have a big deal of sources of how these armies worked, we are actually much better documented on the armies of his successors, that also were seemingly increasing. This army was probably not that different from the one of his successors, of Gonada's successors, but there are some evolutions, and generally speaking, we tend to say today that in the very last generation before the Roman conquest, when there was, by the way, a lot of warfare involving the phalanx, the employment of the phalanx, these successor states had began to develop seemingly. There was a sort of a revival of military of tactical developments, let's say, in that last phase. Usually we see this first half of this third century as a whole as a bit of an empty space, mostly because it's not documented. For instance, this happens also for the Seleucid army, that basically we know nothing about the Seleucid army for the whole 3rd century BC, before Antiochus the Great reforms it in some measure and sends it to reconquer also part of the East, etc. And we start being better documented. Also because these powers get into actually also into the Roman orbit. So sometimes we know even something from the Roman side that adds up to... There were still normally Greek historians, but like Polybius, for instance, that were writing for the Romans. So it was always the Greeks at this point that had the best, obviously, intellectual skills, and that, historiographically speaking, wrote down things. The Romans were still pretty rough. They considered the literate's life as one of an effeminated, essentially. So these cultural characteristics are important because they affected, like in this sense, actively our the availability when not the same production of sources. Is pretty serious business. So the only let's say characteristics that Antigonus Gonatas armies had that distinguished it from the one of his successors were the use of elephants. Now, elephants were pretty much had been a feature of these successor armies, especially since these dynasties had ventured into India. So these were mostly Indian elephants. There were also African elephants, by the way. Especially the Ptolemies, obviously being ruling in North Africa, they had access to that. But even the Ptolemies used Indian elephants. By the way, there were also different races, different species not races of elephants that eventually even went extinguished. Today do not exist anymore. I will discuss that into a dedicated video on the war elephants of the Hellenistic armies. But let's say that Gonadas, in this sense, Gonadas elephants were a bit represent a bit the legacy of this previous moment of the successors' military history, into which substantially elephants were pretty much exchanged and around, where these successor states kind of molded, sedentarized in their various core of power. Some of them didn't have access to elephants anymore. So we've seen Pyrrhus had access to elephants, also Gonadas. Then eventually you don't see elephants there practically anymore. The only ones who actually bring back elephants into Greece at that point were the Romans, because after the Second Punic War, they had their Numidian allies providing them with such beasts, and therefore, even during the Roman conquest of Greece, in many battles in Roman armies, you could see elephants and not in the Macedonian armies anymore. So Gonadas had these 20 elephants that actually came that had survived, let's say, since Alexander's time. They passed basically to many different successors, including Antipater, Cassandrus, Lysimachus, eventually Ptolemy, Ceraunus, and eventually arrived to the Antigonids. So after these elephants died, I suppose. I mean, I don't doubt that they died. I mean, that I don't know if they were killed. I don't know, or they died, hopefully of natural causes. The Macedonians never had access to elephants anymore. So the passing to the composition of the Antigonid armies, and starting from actually from cavalry. Start from cavalry now. You know that in Hellenistic warfare, cavalry was a very prominent arm, and the Macedonians had this sort of feudal society. It was actually pretty rare into Europe at the time. This was possible thanks to the pastors of Macedon, to the strongly aristocratic nature of the Macedonian society. So even names as Philip, for instance, stress the fact that a proper aristocrat was also a horseman. So this exists to tell the truth also in the rest of Europe, but I've made lots of videos in which I discuss how this Indo-European influence, so the ideal of the freeman, cavalryman, let's say, was still there. But the Macedonians were actually one of the few peoples in Europe, if not the only one, who could field very, very heavy cavalry, thanks to this, say, feudal system. So this cavalry was used actually in shock fashion. Was heavy cavalry, not as heavy as the feudal ones of the Middle Ages. So these guys didn't have the stirrups. They wore just hippo sandals. I mean, the horses wore hippo sandals, and therefore the shock power was still pretty much contained. But for those time standards, it was actually, especially for Western standards, it was a pretty much of a great arm. And so the Macedonians had this great ethos put place on cavalry. This think about the Turiaparoy, so the companions of Alexander, the story with Bucephalus, and the love of Macedonian aristocracy for horses, war, and wine. To be honest, all these Macedonian nobles were a bunch of very messed up alcoholists, telling the truth, and that was fine for their short life, because they usually didn't live enough thanks to warfare, let's say, for having their liver collapse in their 30s, let's say. But that was also a way to temper, let's say, fear, anxiety. These using drugs of sorts or alcohol into war is something that, especially alcohol, gives you this immediate strong energy to spend. It was typical of those peoples who really had this strong emphasis on strong, quick charges to annihilate the enemy. And it is relatively strange that Antigonid armies actually had a less cavalry in the Antigonid armies had a lesser role than it had been in the times of Alexander, and also a less important role than the one they had also in the other successor states. Antigonus the Third Dozen, for instance, he was another ruler of Antigonid Macedon, who reigned from in the later 3rd century BC. He was king from 229 BC. He succeeded Matter II. He fought extensively. Also, he's famous essentially for the Battle of Sellasia, which he defeated the Spartans. So we'll talk also about Sellasia later. And in fact, in the same Battle of Sellasia, Antigonus the Third deployed only 300 Macedonian horse. Philip V, other great commander of Antigo, our great king and a military commander in the sense of Antigonid Macedon, mostly famous for his clashes against the Romans, the Battle of Kynoskephali. In Greek, that would be Chinoskephali, right, in the Anglicized. Exactly at the Battle of Kynoskephali in 197 BC had actually 2,000 Macedonian and Thessalian cavalrymen. So in this later phase, we see at least Macedonian cavalry is gonna increase in numbers. And in fact, Perseus, actually without even controlling, even without the resources of Thessaly, that was usually a very important source of cavalrymen for the Antigonid Kingdom, raised 3,000 Macedonian cavalry proper on its own. So what we basically see is an increase of cavalry in the Antigonid armies from the beginning to, especially to the very end of Antigonid Macedon. Why is this? Well, the idea is, first of all, that Macedon had, after the times of Alexander, had been partly abandoned by the nobility that had participated essentially en masse to Alexander's invasion of Asia. So all these successors actually come, aside from pair them, from this Macedonian nobility, and they remained in Asia. So either they died in there, either they founded these other successor states. As a consequence, Macedonia was now deprived with the bulk of its aristocracy. That was also incidentally the one that fielded such heavy cavalry. The fact that other successor states made an extensive use of cavalry, however, I should check the numbers now, but we'll talk about it later also for the Antigonids, is actually the amount of mercenaries or Macedonian troops. You know that the name Macedonian actually remains in every single successor state to designate usually the phalanx. I made a video some time ago on Syrians, Mesopotamians and Persian in the Seleucid army, because there is this, I mean, in a nutshell, the problem is that these guys were called Macedonians because in honor of Alexander's Macedonians that had come there to fight in the phalanx. But over time, these powers eventually had to enroll to hire local troops even to form the phalanx. The same Alexander, before dying, he was projecting an expedition to Arabia and eventually to Carthage by disbanding the Macedonians, sending their home into the Balkans, and actually hiring Persian phalangites in their place. So basically this Macedonian name remained, even if these guys didn't come from Macedonia at all. So in Ptolemaic Egypt, Macedonians; in Seleucid, Syria and Mesopotamia, Macedonians. The actual true Macedonians at this point remained the ones of Antigonid Macedon, as a matter of fact. But this is also pretty relative in the sense that Hellenistic society was pretty multi-ethnic. So being a Macedonian was not a matter of really of blood, but rather of community. Especially these Hellenistic powers were a bit more open culturally than the Hellenic city-states proper, that instead were pretty xenophobic. Also, if they partly got kind of influenced by Hellenistic culture in this sense as well. But it was pretty normal in the ancient world to have this kind of ethnical mixing and eventually integration into ethnical blocks that were they had this ethnic identity, but that were actually something to which also people coming from other cultures were essentially adhering to and becoming in turn parts of those. So I explained it in that video, especially on the Seleucid army. But the point here with Antigonid cavalry was that probably Macedon was at the beginning of the 3rd century BC, in fact, not able to field huge amounts of troops in the first place, because of all the instability, of all the crises that had taken place in there. And just progressively towards the end of the 3rd century, you see that the Macedonians are able to field actually a proper national army, also with more consistent numbers. So even these 2,000 Macedonian Thessalian cavalry at Cunus Cephalae and 3,000 Macedonian cavalry proper at the times of Perseus do not let us are still pretty contained numbers. These numbers basically varied in percentage, equated to in percentage to a 5-10% of the whole Macedonian army. But I would add that such numbers are actually pretty large for those times standards anyhow, especially considering that this was probably very effective cavalry, so probably there was also a lot of quality attached, while other as shock troops, as was saying, and while other mercenaries were usually lighter. We will see it there. So even these contained numbers to me are not really a few overall, and this is especially important considering also the numbers of the phalanx proper, that we'll see it later. So in the case of Perseus, this last 3,000 Macedonian cavalrymen probably were the result of a general revival of Macedonian economy and demographics that occurred in the last 30 years of general peace since the defeat of Kynoskephali in 197 BC. So these factors are also important. Sometimes we think the ancient world was a bottomless pool from which soldiers just emerged magically, but as a matter of fact, these were still very, say, poor worlds for our standards. So even after such a big defeat like the one of Kynoskephali, it was it took generations before you could still field another effective phalanx. Because manpower is not something that in pre-industrial time you can recover with a snap, as if, theoretically it was feasible, because it's not even that here Macedon was completely depopulated, but it has also a political and social and economical cost. If these guys are peasants and Macedonian economy was about agriculture mostly, you take them away from the fields, yeah, you can have an army, but how the hell can you feed them in the first place? And this would lead to revolts, and also it was pretty complicated actually too, and very laborious and extremely really an extreme effort, even for these relatively strong Hellenistic states to rise an army once again. And it's remarkable that at the end of this time, of these 30 years of peace, in the 60s of the 2nd century BC, 3,000 3,000 cavalry could be fielded by Macedonia alone, together with, by the way, with other pretty consistent bodies of troops, as we will see. So the general quality of the Antigonid cavalry was high. The Macedonian pastors were still there, so it just took them to repopulate them, to be controlled by the kingdom, and it just took time for them to manage to field, to allow to field consistent body of cavalrymen. The cavalry was extremely important because these Antigonid dynasts kept essentially they remained faithful to their ancestors' traditions and keeping being good knights, good cavalrymen their own. This was actually present in every successor state. As a matter of fact, cavalry was praised as a status symbol, essentially. So it remained as a Macedonian legacy all over the Hellenistic world. So there were, and in fact, the Antigonid bodyguards, like one of the other successors, were mounted usually, or at least there was a particular unit that was the sacred Ile. There was essentially this picked body of cavalrymen that escorted the king into battle and all. For instance, Philip V had 400, say, household cavalry in 219 BC, who maybe correspond to the Ile. We don't know, because from the sources we can't really figure it out properly, but it's very likely. At Sellasia, Antigonus the Third had 300, and they're probably the same unit, even if a bit of a lower strength, but even the organics actually varied. There wasn't like a fixed number of troops. The numbers could really fluctuate We will see it later, even for the same phalanx. So a big deal, as we were saying, to field these armies was actually finding the resources to field them. So this was a kind of a desperate race, and in this desperate race you could definitely have more or less troops. So there weren't like fixed units with that number, with that strength, and that's it. All armies in history have been either under or over strength for some reason, and it was normal, absolutely normal to vary in time, and especially during campaign. As we were saying, together with the say native cavalry of Macedonia, there were also other. I say Macedonian in the Latin way. You can say Macedon as well. I will stick to Macedon. So the native cavalry of Macedon was usually also supported by other cavalry. Hellenistic warfare was very advanced, very sophisticated. It was based on combined armed tactics. Alexander's empire had basically conquered the whole known world at the time. So these successor states entered in contact with a myriad of different populations that they necessarily needed as allies to keep these dominions together, and even engaging them in the local government, especially in the outer regions, in a decentralized fashion. And as we've said, these successor states were also pretty wealthy usually. So yeah, money was always a problem. Macedon, for instance, faced lots of economical crises that weren't just about a shortage of liquids in terms of money, but also of manpower, as we've seen. But spending money for bodies of troops was actually, for mercenaries, was actually pretty standard. By the way, even Macedon, that controlled Greece at a point, or at least was able to have an hegemonic rule over it, even if they didn't make it to conquer it wholly. The Greek city-states usually helped Macedon with money, usually, meaning that they also provided certain citizen troops, or maybe mercenaries on their own. So this would lead, obviously, to the hiring of mercenaries as an habitual practice, also for these for the Antigonid army. So at Battle of Sellasia, as we've seen in 221, if I'm not wrong, 222, sorry, the Antigonids fielded 600 Greek allies and 300 mercenaries. Philip V later used Galatian cavalry as well, because the Celts at this point had settled in the lower Danube, pretty close to Macedon, and also in Asia Minor. So there were these Celtic mercenaries pretty readily accessible for the Macedonians in there. And the Celts were usually, as we've said, praised for being good troops, as a matter of fact. And however, probably the largest bodies of mercenaries that or at least the most habitual ones and the most readily accessible for Antigonid Macedon were the Thracians and the Illyrians. Perseus had sort of a picked body of Thracians, 1,000 Thracians at the Battle of Pydna. And in Chalcidican garrison of Cassandreia, the 200 Illyrian cavalry is witnessed historically. So these were troops that were normally siding, were say a normal presence into Antigonid armies. As by the way, the relation of Antigonid Macedon with these populations was pretty intense, because they essentially made up the northern border of Macedon. So they were just beyond the northern border of Macedon. So they interacted also with into Macedonian politics. They had their own ancient relations, sometimes even bad relations. I mean, the Macedonians had originally invaded Thrace. Philip's II army back in the day was being built essentially with the gold and silver of the Thracian mines that had been seized by the Macedonians. But as it always happens in history, even natural enemies can have interests in common and bonding in some measure. And by the way, these were usually, we'll see it especially later with other foot mercenaries. There were troops that were also pretty sometimes there were actually allied contingents, others were free bands of mercenaries. So the market of war was pretty dynamic, especially in the Hellenistic world. So another prominent figure of Antigonid armies were the so-called Peltasts. So this was a corps of native Macedonians that are called in this way. You know that Peltast means essentially the guy who carries a pelte. So it was this shield that can be usually it's associated to the one that the Thracians used, but actually pelte can be also pretty more neutral and generic term. By the way, it's very, very interesting that the Greeks called their military units, with a very few exceptions, with the name of the shield that we're carrying. Think about the hoplite, the peltast, the Turiaparoy, etc. Whereas the Romans, for instance, called the units with their on the base of their offensive weapons usually. So this is also pretty interesting culturally, and as far as I know, it's never been researched as historically speaking. And the Peltasts really in Hellenistic warfare are these usually lighter troops that are used to skirmish essentially, while the Macedonian Peltasts actually were seemingly an elite corps. A picked body of probably also of Macedonian noblemen, probably also the youngest one who had to prove something, and were pretty strong and dynamic, and were used because the army's segmentations at these times were based also on the age, definitely on the physical fitness, etc. And these Antigonid Peltasts would be essentially the equivalent, both in status and maybe in equipment, but that unfortunately we don't know pretty much, to Alexander's Hypaspists. So the Hypaspists, in Greek it's Upaspistai. They also here the shield remains because the name is essentially shield bearers. Were this pretty dynamic unit that Alexander's pretty versatile unit that Alexander used, and it used to be found as a name also in other successor states that unfortunately about which we don't really know much. Sometimes these Hypaspistae, say in Greek, are described as pikemen, so like part of the phalanx. Sometimes they are used as a sort of special. They were definitely elite even in the phalanx. Sometimes they're used as a sort of commandos for cover operations and assaults of citadels and stuff like that. So they were in Alexander's campaigns, they really played a very, very important role and very dynamic one, sometimes crucial. So these were a sort of an elite of sorts. And seemingly every successor state had a sort of elite corps like that. So the Antigonids had these Peltasts. Probably royal Peltasts would be a better name to call them in that case. And especially in the case, however, of Antigonid Macedon, the Hypaspists actually appear as the very king's bodyguards and aides. So troops that had a very core role in defending the sovereign. It was a bit they represented a bit the honor of Macedon in itself. So this corps was actually pretty large. It could reach up to thousands. So within this corps, this is a pretty important indicator, because it's not just the Peltasts weren't really just a few elite picked body troops. When you have such large numbers, tendentially these troops are gonna be segmented and organized, and probably they also have a sort of political and social stand on their own that makes them relatively self-sufficient in certain military contexts. So they have probably we don't know anything, practically almost anything about their organization, but probably they had even certain differentiations, tactical specializations within their ranks. Seemingly within these thousands of Peltasts, there was an elite body, so the elite of the elite, named the Agama. So the Agama is a term that probably, if you're interested into Hellenistic warfare, you have already heard in some fashion. So Agama actually is a term that comes from the Greek verb ago, which I believe, I hope I pronounced it correctly, that means to route, to drive. So it means like a pack of a routing pack of men, or a sort of detachment with a single commander. And what is interesting is that they are called also in other ways by Livy, by other authors, including Livy, that gives this in Latin. He actually calls them Nicatoras. So this is the Latin, the bad Latinization of the Greek Nicatores. So the winners, the conquerors, the Nike is the victory in the sacred way. It's a bit like I made a video on the meanings that existed attached to these celestial deities that corresponded, like also in the case of the Roman eagle, to the ancient Indo-European idea of glory. That was military glory was everything with immortality in the Indo-Aryan culture. So the Macedons were calling these elite of the elite dinicatores, so those who basically take that celestial victory. So that has even a sacred meaning, and you have to think naturally that this ancient world, and especially for these very elite units, had lots of religious meanings attached to such military bodies, let's say. It was normal. This, first of all, happened all over the army. At that time, politics and religion were only one thing. Erase from your mind the positivistic myth that the ancient world was a secular world, because that's a progressist invention that has nothing to do with factual history. These guys had probably a lot of rituals, a lot of you have to think of initiatory rites as well. Were also pretty tough processes and had to strengthen the esprit de corps, the sense of belonging, etc. And this elite of the elite was definitely made up of the best fighters of Macedon at the time. So Livy actually calls them in this fashion the conquerors, the vanquishers, let's say. And he states that were chosen for their strength, vigor, and youth. So these were the youngers of the probably of the noble families of Macedon. So these were always regarded as elite troops of some sort. Antigonus the Third had 3,000 Peltasts at the Battle of Sellasia. For the Battle of Kynoskephali, we have a number of 2,000. Philip V had 5,000 in 219 BC. So we see these fluctuating numbers. And in the case of Perseus, instead we have the actual information that of the 5,000 Peltasts that the monarch fielded, 2,000 formed the Agama, so the picked body. So this has led to some speculation of sort that is essentially that the Peltasts were probably a body of 5,000, of which roughly only a section, like 2,000 or 3,000, made up the very elite. And the others might have been also sort of retainers. Think that these were probably noblemen. So these guys had the aids, there was a very aristocratic ethos into ancient Macedon in this sense. So they and we know that in fact they fought as elite. The Peltasts are especially famous in Antigonid military history for the stand they made against the Romans at the Battle of Pydna. So at the Battle of Pydna, the Antigonid Peltasts first of all were managed to kick, say to make route. I think there were two Italic contingents, two Italic cohorts. Yes, I know cohorts formally. There were still cohorts among the Italics, especially. That was their original name. And eventually, when things got rough, and the Macedonian army began to fled, the only ones who fought to the death on the field were the Peltasts, these 3,000 elite troops. So the idea is that these were the cream of the Antigonid forces. and we don't know really how they were organized. They probably were subdivided into Kiliarchy, sorry, that were this subdivision that is found also into the Phalanx proper. And we don't know how these guys really fought. This is the problem. We don't know whether they were they probably were heavy troops of some sort. We might think of them to have had these subdivisions, these sub-specializations, so they probably could fight as, I don't know, as swordsmen, as even as elite skirmishers, or maybe they also had they also fought as spearmen, as a solid, thickly packed formation, not differently from the phalanx proper. And the fact that they were the subdivision in Kiliarchy is that they actually have this thousands of, they have this rounded 1,000 number, so that might have been that is kind of a legitimate suggestion. So let's pass to the phalanx proper, because one might think actually that the phalanx was the main thing of these armies, and seemingly it wasn't not, from a numerically speaking. As a matter of fact, the Macedons had we have seen they had the smallest proportion of cavalry in successors' armies, but they had the higher proportion of the highest numbers of pikemen proportionally in the army than the other successors, of all the other successors. So this is important because it means the Antigonid army had even more phalangites proportionately than at the times of Alexander. This is pretty important because, in my opinion, corresponds to a greater sedentarization of Macedon. At the time of Philip II and of Alexander, Macedon was still pretty tribal in many ways. At this point, there was a process of partly of that corresponded also to an Hellenization of Macedon itself. The Macedons spoke Greek at this point, but they weren't really Greek as such. In fact, the Greeks were were accusing them of being sort of barbaric, chiefly because of their political models that were pretty oligarchic. So they were against. There was a lot of hypocrisy actually beyond this, but surely these were monarchies, so were something quite different from the Greek city-states. But as a matter of fact, and the Macedonians were roughly Thraco-Illyrian in origin, ethnically speaking. And however, Antigonid Macedon really did undergo to a sort of democratization of some sort. This probably, as we have seen, corresponded to we don't have to take it as a sort of democracy, but it was simply the idea that the state, so the dynasty actually of the Antigonids, acquired a greater strength over Macedon. It made even the oligarchy rotating in offices. This is a pretty good indicator that goes along with a bit with what we have said before about the Macedonian society. Especially after this, all the nobles had went to Asia in Alexander's times. Then the country had suffered of wars, of ravaging, and all. So the Antigonids managed to rebuild a bit from scratch. And especially around this ethnic, let's say, national core of Macedon. So that for them, also in terms of military organization, that is very, very important, because one thing is ruling something like the Seleucid Empire that stretches literally from the Aegean Sea to almost to India, practically, and say to Afghanistan. And you need actually an army that is also pretty scattered, with military colonies here and there to control the whole thing. With Macedon, you had this extreme luck that you don't find practically in any other successor state, of having the core of your domains that are the ancient Macedonian ones. So there is a sort of ethnic homogeneity. It's also a smaller territory to control, and that, strategically speaking, has many advantages overall. So in the case of Macedon, probably this brought to the engagement of actually the larger Macedonian population to actually join the army. So not really forming these military colonies like it happened into Ptolemaic Egypt or Seleucid Syria and Mesopotamia, just to have these garrisons scattered all over the empire. And this was basically all the male able-bodied citizens were subjects were actually made the phalanx join. So this probably also explains why this Antigonid phalanx was more numerous proportionally compared to the rest of the army. And this explains also in part why even cavalry is seen as in such smaller contingents, because the infantry were more, infantrymen were more numerous. Probably this Macedonian cavalry was also pretty good in quality, so it was a more elite thing, and it was in more contained numbers. So we have this contrast between the number of cavalry and infantry. But it does correspond not really to anything negative, in my opinion, at all. Also because I consider personally Antigonid armies to have been pretty overlooked, especially in the last phases. I'm all about the Romans. I'm a great advocate for the actual untold deficiency of the Macedonian phalanx. There is this idea that the Roman legion had to win at every time against the phalanx. As a matter of fact, most of the times, reasons why the Romans won were a bit different from the strictly systemic ones that people want to buy in, that the phalanx was an inferior system, especially from a strictly I'm throwing myself into a mess now. So I promise I will talk about that very thoroughly in a dedicated video. For now, let's just say that I like the Antigonid army, and relatively to the proportions of the strength of the army, at the 222 BC Battle of Sellasia, the infantry, the phalanx was, the Antigonid phalanx made up essentially 1/3 of the army, and it was actually pretty low. It was the lowest recorded in the Antigonid army because there were a freaking lot of Greek allies in there that also partly fought as phalangites. So we will see it later when we talk about the infantry, the mercenary infantry. At the Battle of Kynos-Kephali, 197 BC, it reached the Macedonian phalanx reached about a 62%. 2/3. At Pydna I said 1/2. So pretty consistent numbers. Basically, you have all these forces and this very solid bulk of line of phalangites that, in this sense, are your the spearhead. I don't know what you call that, but they are the army proper. And the rest is essentially support units that are not less important, because the Macedonian, the Hellenistic tactics were based essentially into this interaction, especially of phalanx and cavalry. So, as we were saying, probably every free Macedonian was obliged to serve in the army. And on this point, the property say the census was not important anymore. Before we were saying that this in other successor states were these colonies, which essentially meant that there were lands that were given to the veterans to serve for them and their descendants to serve into the army through essentially the equipment that they could also partly provide for themselves. Even though, say that in all the successor states, the state always basically controlled, especially the pikes production, and there was a relatively high degree of centralization. This probably was even truer for Macedon. So the equipment, the military equipment was given by the same, provided by the same monarchy. So a very central, a very tight grip from central power, and this is pretty useful also in terms of territorial control, because you don't risk revolts and all. You have all your weaponry in your capital. You can control everything, and you can arm your levies wherever you want. So, by the way, consider that moving in a phalanx, as we were saying before, was something exceptional. It didn't happen by standard. These were extremely costly armies, and they were fielded only for the strict necessary. And yet, when they were fielded, it was usually for the serious business. Okay, so battles that could really decide the fate of the kingdom. In fact, you see that it took practically 30 years after the defeat of Kynoskephali for Macedon to actually recover a full functional army. Luckily enough, the Romans had not really wiped out Macedon after the defeat of Kynoskephali, also because they needed it to counter the Seleucid. At the time it was not known, but eventually that was useful for the Romans themselves, because when the Seleucids invaded Greece, and the Macedons actually fought alongside the Romans, so that they had still troops to send. But in other times, the economical situation of Macedon was pretty grim. Even at the same times of Kynoskephali, they weren't faring that well, telling the truth. There was a crisis striking there. So it's even more amazing they were able to field that army. There were, however, for these demographic problems that we mentioned, there is evidence of Macedonians settling barbarians into their own land in return for military service. So there is evidence also in here of bodies of troops that were basically provided by sort of this settlement system, but we don't think it was really like with the colonies. These were normal settlements of some sort. Also, by the way, these barbarians were usually semi-nomadic in lifestyle. So it wasn't really about having a structural military organization here. It was a system of recruitment that otherwise functioned well for the strategic reasons we stated before. At this point, it was really about refilling Macedon with manpower, because demographic crisis was that bad. So, and this system didn't happen for the rest of the subjects, indeed, that already lived in there. So there was no need to expend extra money for the monarchy to do what? To raise people that are. You just make barbarians settling, also probably not in the best places of Macedon in terms of fertility and all, so that you can they can't even maybe be a good defenders of those lands. This was also usually done. It was done eventually also by the Romans. You settled the barbarians in places where you want them to form a bulwark against other populations, or simply against brigands that were a plague also in the ancient world. So, how was the Antigonid army phalanx organized? Well, probably there were two equal corps that made up the phalanx: the Chalcaspides and the Leucaspides. So these other two corps, once again, as was noticed before, are named after the shields essentially they were wearing. So Chalcaspides simply means bronze shields, and Leucaspides white shields. So Chalcis is bronze, and Leucus is bright, is white. So what was really the difference? Well, we don't really know, aside from these shield patterns, maybe that varied, but aside from this, those could vary even within the same unit, I think, in some measure. Also because there were pretty large bodies of men, as we will see now. But the main difference, seemingly, is that the bronze shields seemingly are to be found in Antigonid military history in faraway expeditions, while the white shields are not present on those occasions. So the idea is being speculated that basically the bronze shields were the younger men, so the guys who were more suitable for greater physical exertions, let's say. And so it's interesting because this form of segmentation existed also into the Roman army, for instance, with the only difference that the Roman army segmented it more, say, in a different way, and they didn't make corps on their own. The legion fought always with those elements. These instead were seemingly sort of two separated phalanxes, so two separated armies of the younger and maybe other. This is, by the way, a speculation, so we don't really know, but it could be true. In terms of military service, maybe there was even a passage from the Chalcaspides to the Leucaspides with age. I don't know. I'm just speculating now, so I don't want to say wrong things. But it's so much what we don't know, unfortunately, that sometimes we can only speculate for what it's worth. So, in terms of the organics of the phalanx, that in this sense was probably very similar, it was probably identical between the Chalcaspides and Leucaspides, and we don't know about the Peltasts. The main tactical unit of the phalanx was the Speira. This was made up of 256. So we are talking about a size that corresponds. I always like to make this these comparisons. This corresponds to sorts of 250 would be a company. Can't fit into a company, and not a battalion. And this was in turn. So the company, is the major tactical unit in a. Historically speaking, it's basically the singular. It's basically the unit size that it's the last unit size in strength that is commanded from an officer by an officers on the field, whereas the rest is commanded by superior officers that watch on the distance. So this means that it's the main tactical unit because it's the strongest one, it's the largest one, that comprehends the others, by the way, the smaller ones, by the way, hierarchically, and that has more tactical dynamism on the field. So the Spera was in turn subdivided into 4 so-called tetrarchiae. So these were made up 64 soldiers. So this was instead sort of a platoon size, and each one was composed in turn of 4 files of 16 troops. So this system is clearly very similar to the one that is described anciently for, the phalanx, the original phalanx by Asclepiodotus. And for the Antigonid army, we actually miss the evidence of this intermediate unit, the so-called Dilochia and Taxis, but sometimes this is maybe a bit of a theoretical problem, because every army kind of organizes itself in first of all in different ways, but generally speaking also this, platoon and company level is probably what really makes effectively the difference. Other subdivisions could be other, maybe something even cultural. You have to think of other kind of segmentations that probably existed even within the same phalanx that we can't really fully understand. So the Sperae, so this company-size system, were eventually forming up a greater, usually regiment size unit, the Chiliarchia. That was made up of 4 Sperae. So there is evidence also other terms like meros, for instance, and this unit, this battalion, this say was mostly a battalion size. Well, it depends. Well, obviously the equivalents also in organics can vary. A regiment can be made up even by 1,000. And this was made up, in fact, by roughly 1,000. It can be also an equivalent of the battalion, if you want. So this, and they were commanded by an hegemon. So these were major, also bigger tactical bodies that could be grouped into eventually the strategiae. So the idea is that the strategia is being speculated whether the strategia was strategia is or strategia, I don't know what the accent is in Greek, was made up of a fixed number of Chiliarchiae. But there is not really the counts don't really up to can't really let us see a standard size of the strategiae. In fact, for instance, the Battle of Sellasia, the Chalcaspides and the Leucaspides were 5,000 men each. At the Battle of Kynoskephali, they were the 2 divisions of the phalanx were 8,000 each. So this strategia could really vary pretty largely in size, as we were saying before. And in fact, the strategos, that is the officer that that commanded it, is also etymologically speaking a pretty flexible term in terms of meaning. And as we were saying before, we have to think of these units, especially as long as the larger they become, to be extremely non-standard in size, while probably the Sperae and the Kiliarchiae were probably always roughly that 200, 300, respectively 200, 300, and 1,000. These strategiae weren't, they could vary, oscillate. Also because, tactically speaking, on the field, even if there were such large divisions, it's obvious that from a tactical point of view, they would have been commanded not as those huge blocks, but were other subdivisions, as we have seen. Chiefly the Sperae were the ones that eventually in combat had the greater dynamism. So these greater regroupments were something more organizational than else. Also, militarily speaking, simplicity is a principle. So splitting the phalanx into these very large bodies simply equated to say, okay, this one goes in that direction, this one goes in that other. But then how they were practically commanded, it's something that went that was on a smaller unit. The strategos just had to tell them to advance, essentially, and to take a direction. Then it was the other sub officers that took care of how eventually the combat would take place. And unfortunately, we don't know a bit much more. As we're saying today, I'm not gonna make a military history of Antigonid Macedon. We're just gonna stick to the organization. But I promise that in other videos I will talk about the single battles into which the Antigonid phalanx was employed. By the way, I was lucky enough to have done at university years ago. I wrote actually a little thesis about chiefly this hotly and very famous, say, vexata quaestio, to say it in the Latin way, of the Manipular Legion versus, say, Hellenistic Phalanx. And I studied these single battles in detail, source by source, and they're not really complex. I mean, the sources are very few ones, but it's really it was really instructive, and I formed my own opinion on the matter, and I would like to share it with you one day. So I promise I won't let you down. I know my channel is mostly about medieval history, but I take great passion also for ancient history in many ways. So, passing to the mercenary troops. So we have seen even the number of the phalanx weren't excessively numerous, as we lots of other troops were provided by mercenaries and allies. So there is a broader strategical need. It's not just a matter of making mass, so using other troops, because the Macedonian, say, citizens were a valuable resource for the kingdom. So the phalanx was usually trying to be spared. It was a bit like with the Romans. The Romans usually made the auxiliaries fighting rather than the legionaries, because the state had invested so much in the legionaries that they didn't want to throw them away into attrition combat, and they tended to use them only in these major pitched battles or in siege assaults where they could work best. So it was for the Macedonian phalangites that actually were preferably spared, while other units were that also had a greater tactical flexibility than the phalanx could perform certain tasks. And we see it perfectly, especially in the case of Antigonid Macedon. We must say that especially a king like Philip V made an excellent use of these lighter, especially the lighter troops. They were very instrumental, especially the Battle of Kynoskephali, in spite of the final outcome. But initially speaking, such troops had even managed to win ground over the Romans. So, and this was very important because the phalanx had to be protected, and this integration of lighter elements together with it really corresponded also to a greater flexibility in both in combat and campaign. And in fact, the confrontation between the Romans and Philip's the Fifth army into the chain of Kynoskephali over the hills and the forests is kind of interesting, even from a military history point of view, to see how these armies were flexible actually to go through these hills, very rough hills, and still maintaining cohesion and all. So, as we've seen, there were lots of Greek allies used, that were raised for Antigonid Macedon in Greece, from Greece, and other mercenaries came from other ethnic contingents of the rest of the world. So, at the Battle of Sellasia, there are 300 cavalry and 3,000 infantry. Mercenaries. Then there is other roughly 600 cavalry coming from allies instead, pretty mixed one. By the way, notice at this time how cavalry is really contained in numbers compared to infantry. So this is a moment in military history into which really infantry was the bulk of the army. And as we said at the very beginning, cavalry didn't have this extreme shock power, not even the heaviest Macedonian cavalry, that however could perform very effective charges if properly deployed. So the foot at Sellasia on the Macedonian side comprehended 3,000 Achaean footmen. They were picked body, by the way, because the Achaeans were kind of developing already part of the they had their own. We'll see it later. 100,000 troops, infantry from Megalopolis, 2,000 from Boeotia, and 1,000 from Epirus, and 1,000 from Akarnaeans. So these were all regions, as you see here, that basically between Greece and this would be today's Albania, So these areas that with whom Macedon had historically such these ancient ties, let's say. So what was this infantry really like? Well, some Greek states had been developing actually the same. They had copied essentially the Macedonian phalanx on their own, because the Greeks were already, especially at the times of Iphicrates, had this kind of first step towards the lengthening of the lances and the shortening of the shields. Then eventually it was only Philip II that created the Macedonian Hellenistic phalanx of pikemen as we know it, also for not just as a tactical formula, but also because he had the strategic resources for fielding such armies, because the main problem of the phalanx is that it requires really a lot of resources, and a lot of most of which derives also from the training required for these pikemen to work effectively together, because it's very difficult to make pikemen sticking together. One thing is to have an hoplitic phalanx that works in a very different way. It requires to just stick together very tightly, physically speaking, to make this shield wall and sticking together into the midst. A pikeman, this is a problem that happened also in the Middle Ages. It required a greater deal of training, of collective training, and that is something that you can start having only if you have a very strong centralized state that can impart, that can invest resources for the training of these pikemen, because moving a pike in formation requires first of all a lot of exercise, because the pike oscillates, it's a bit of a trouble to control it, so it needs experience. But secondly, it needs large bodies of men. The pikes are useful as long as you can basically form these very homogeneous and thickly packed formation with large bodies of men, because otherwise you can easily get around it. So it has to be something large and big that has to basically form the wall line, even for hundreds of meters, if not more, and not giving space to, and try to cover the flanks just with other troops, but in this sense having this advancing forest of pikes that you can't avoid in a certain sense. But at this time, at the end of the 3rd century BC, and eventually also in the 2nd century BC, the Greek states had began to emulate in part the Macedonian phalanx. For instance, the Spartans used that. There is evidence also elsewhere, and the reason here is that also these certain areas in here were becoming sort of lordships, so that could provide for, with this centralized means for a sort of a more monarchic army, in this sense, like I said, that was opposed to the democratic mentality, let's say, of the Greeks. So, for instance, the Megalopolitans had been armed as Macedonian phalangites by the same Antigonus the Third on that occasion. That is interesting because we don't know really about the training that is implied. It's not easy to make work a phalanx if you, as we were saying before, if the soldiers are not used actually to fight in that fashion. The Boeotians and the Epirotes actually already fought with a phalanx. We have seen Epirus actually had that form, but telling the truth, even in there where the Molossian dynasty fell, in Epirus, the whole thing became a sort of league, and in this sense also fielding a solid central phalanx like the one of Epirus wasn't basically out there and wasn't feasible anymore. In fact, Epirus after Epirus didn't practically do anything extremely relevant from a military point of view, at least in the Hellenistic, say, relatively to the phalanx. The Akarnaeans, Akarnaean was known as this very poor region of Greece, and they were probably using some light infantry. Which was, by the way, at this time the average trooper that Greece fielded. In fact, the same Achaeans, so coming from a wealthier region of Greece, were actually using the so-called Turiaparoy. The Turios is this shield that takes its name from the door size. And but actually the Greek ones were smaller. The original name was actually used to designate the Celtic shields, and partly also the Italic ones. Now we know that the Greeks made, even since a long time, a use of these shields. I will have also to make a video on the Turiaparoy because people never get it right, to be honest. And they were a bit smaller, but the name had remained attached. They were used also by cavalry. It was a pretty versatile thing. It was mostly the kind of unit that had certain characteristics on its own. It was a pretty flexible infantry that could operate both as melee and as skirmishers. They were essentially used. They were pretty good at covering the flanks of the phalanx, for instance, but they were pretty flexible, dynamic, and also to exploit certain tactical situations. So Philip V used other Achaean and troops later in the day, and he had actually 300 Achaean slingers in 2019 BC. This because Achaia was allied with Macedon. So you see here the smaller contingents of slingers in this case. They were pretty useful, especially in all those operations. Not much in pitched battles, even though slingers could be pretty effective. But probably these Achaean slingers weren't excessive elite. But slingers are useful to harass the enemy in general, so during the marches as explorers and stuff like that. Actually, a very prominent type of missile troops in Antigonid armies that you find virtually at every time in there were Cretan archers. Now, Cretan archers were famous all over the ancient world at this time because they were practically the best archers around. And so Crete, now we didn't talk much about it, but the Macedon at this time had also pretty consistent maritime interests, or at least they looked always with great lust at cities like Rhodes, or just across the Aegean Sea, Pergamon. That was the main strategical target of the Macedonians, and what kept them making them essentially enemies with the Seleucids, especially when eventually the Seleucids invaded Greece. So Crete is just in the south there, and the Cretan mercenaries were to be found basically all over, especially the eastern Mediterranean, as mercenaries. And the Macedonians usually had always them in pretty consistent numbers, by the way, in their armies. In fact, we see, for instance, you find Cretan archers in the Antigonid army at Sellasia. Perseus had 3,000 Cretan archers at the Battle of Pydna. Now that is also interesting. Such large bodies of archers were not really rare, but usually Cretans passed for elite troops. So having 3,000 of them was pretty an amazing thing. Pydna was, it was a major defeat of the Macedonians, but it was also a pretty hardly fought battle, and I don't remember actually a particular role of the Cretans being explicitated by the sources, but if you had been a Roman legionary advancing against the Macedonian phalanx and having all these arrows pouring at you, that must have not been really a pleasant experience. At Pydna, by the way, there were also other 1,000 Greek mercenaries of sorts. By the way, the sources sometimes are pretty generic. They tell us, there were 1,000 other, Akarnaeans, and then we don't know what they were, what they were. They were usually the average type at this point of mercenaries of that kind were the Turiaparoy, so these light infantry usually. So this is it, and there were also other mercenaries used, for instance, for garrison duties, which is kind of normal because the local population evidently didn't fancy prolonged military service of some kind. Mercenaries were available all around, so in peacetime it was normal to have soldiers guarding there, and as I was saying before, having a mercenary was not a concern. These were guys that were paid just like other guards, so they did their job, and that's pretty much it. By the way, the garrison troops were probably small in numbers, nothing excessively subversive in terms. There weren't entire armies that could revolt and all. By the way, expenses were contained at peacetime. So we talked about the Celts in the Antigonid armies, and even though the Macedonians never used as many Celts as in the early times of Antigonus Gonatas, there were still other Galatian contingents that were used at the time. For instance, Antiochus the Third used 1,000 Galatian infantry at the Battle of Sellasia, and Perseus had 2,000 Galatians in the I think it was in the Pydna campaign. against the Romans. At the same time, Perseus needed other troops, and he went asking essentially the Celts for 10,000 cavalry. Now, 10,000 cavalry mercenary is a pretty amazing thing. So this probably didn't involve really just acquiring band by band, but really forming bonds and deals with these populations. By the way, on the same occasion, Perseus asked also other was searching also for other 10,000 infantry from the tribe of the Bastarnae. This was this Balkanic people at the time. We don't know whether they were Celts or Germans, or but were very praised as mercenaries at the time. Were considered by some of the best mercenaries of the world. They were extremely ferocious, usually light infantry, armed also with pretty nasty weapons, and but actually Perseus refused eventually to hire these 20,000, essentially 10,000 cavalry, 10,000 infantry from this tribal world because of the costs. And so he eventually fought with no cavalry, no Celtic cavalry at all. But this episode to me is very interesting because it actually shows, first of all, the availability of such troops. Leave aside the price, because economic problems are all out there in recruiting armies in history. But the fact that the Celts could sell 10,000 horses. Now you have to think the Celts were pretty keen on horses. Once again, now I will repeat the fact of the Indo-European mythology of the horse. Yes, I will repeat that because that's important. The Gauls especially had a great passion for horses, but in spite of what is commonly thought, and I strongly believe in this, Celtic cavalry was not this big deal. I mean, basically we get this sense of Celtic cavalry that was something strong for many reasons. First of all, in modern popular culture, there is this kind of there is a lot of neo-reconsiderations about peoples, and essentially whichever people you like, you have to magnify its strength. So all the Celts lovers say, oh well, the Celtic cavalry was so strong. No, Celtic cavalry was not strong at all. This is a myth that is being created, historiographically speaking, chiefly by the Romans, because the Romans didn't have a big deal of cavalry quantitatively speaking. Another prejudice is that the Romans didn't have strong cavalry. That's also completely false, historically speaking. Roman cavalry was excellent. They just had a few in numbers, because in Italy they didn't have. They had actually good horses, but they couldn't actually have them in large numbers. So the main problems with the Romans facing the Celts is that the Celts instead had lots of cavalry, quantitatively speaking, but in terms of quality, I mean, I'm not going to debate the individual skills of the Celtic cavalryman, who was also footman, by the way. It was the full pack of the Celtic warrior in there. But what makes the difference is the collective training. The Celtic cavalries had a very poor collective training. Hence their cavalry didn't have a good quality. Armies like the ones of the Macedons now, with this cavalry, they had strong cavalry. That was strong cavalry. Celtic cavalry was numerous, was pugnacious, etc., but it had a very low collective training, simply because the Celts didn't have solid political formations. Their strength was mostly based on national cohesion. You find very good Celtic cavalry, for instance, in the case of the Remi tribe of the Belgi in the north of France. It would be today's Belgium, by the way. But those were isolated cases also seemingly certain areas between the Rhine, the Germanic and the Gallic world had good cavalry, but still they weren't disciplined, and their cohesion was relatively low. So all this myth was created by the Romans because that was still cavalry, and that's what the Romans usually didn't have in such large numbers, and therefore people now think that make the equation, oh, the Romans were scared about Gallic cavalry, hence Gallic cavalry was strong. No, it wasn't. It was just numerous. It's a different thing. And I repeat, I'm not discussing now the individual quality of the warrior. It was pretty high. But the quality of the formation, that is what really makes the difference in actual combat. Especially against disciplined armies like the ones of the Greeks or the Romans at this time, especially in the Hellenistic times. So it's amazing that Macedon could have access to these troops relatively to the Bastarnae. We were saying were also pretty tough infantry as well, and also pretty huge numbers. Then I don't remember which source actually states this, but even maybe 20,000 mercenaries is a bit of an exaggeration here. Probably the source wanted to stress the missed opportunity and stressing the fact that Macedon didn't have money at this point. Probably the contingents were smaller. In any case, in Antigonid armies we still find Galatians into the later times, albeit not as in big numbers like in the early Antigonus Gonatas days. So another very important ethnic component of the Macedonian army were the Akarnaeans and the Paeonians. And these were certain peoples that came actually from... These were Thraco-Illyrian peoples. These weren't actually that different, ethnically speaking, from the Macedonians themselves. Also, the Macedonians had emerged from that ethnical melting pot. But these were tribesmen. They were troops living at the margins of the Macedonian world and providing historically very important units. You see that also in Alexander's armies. So there were 1,000 Akarnaeans at Sellasia. Sellasia was a very big battle where lots of people from the Antigonid Achaean side were something like 28,000 infantry and 1,200 cavalry. The Spartans and could field 20,000 infantry, 650 cavalry. So that's why we find so many contingents that made up these numbers, and we have references about the same battles for this. Philip V had 500 Akarnaeans in 219 BC, and Perseus actually had a pretty large force of 3,000 among Akarnaeans, Paeonians, and Thracians. They were even settled in Macedon itself. So that was the settling I was mentioning before. So these units were usually lighter troops. They were tribesmen. So tribesmen mostly fought like that. Only the elites had heavier equipment that, by the way, were pretty much, especially in that region, up to Dacia, even into the Balkans, were pretty much resenting of the Greek material culture. So you might find these guys actually wearing pretty much Hellenistic styled armor, and I made a video about the Illyrian, I don't remember now, I've got it on the channel somewhere, the Illyrian weapons and armor, something like that, and I discussed that, and there it's pretty evident, because I've got a lot of pictures that tell us how these guys, and never fall into the mistake of thinking that wearing a particular style of armor or a particular type of gear equates to fight like the people from which those things come. Because actually this is a mistake that happens all the time. thinking that a guy that is using, I don't know, an Oplon fights like an Oplite. No, really not. That's not how it works. And these guys were pretty keen actually on Greek stuff, because it came from the rich world, right? And these were poor tribesmen, and their elites wanted to show off by essentially buying from Greek traders these items that were pretty was a luxury good for them, and a status symbol, evidently. So at the skirmish at Kallinikos in 171 BC between Antigonid Macedon and the Romans, it was a bit more than a skirmish, really. Also, the Romans suffered pretty heavy casualties, seemingly, there. There were lots of these javeliners and slingers that probably came from such populations in the Antigonid army, and the Illyrians were also prominent. Now that we named them before, element in there. Epirus was essentially an half Greek and half Illyrian state. And it had, as we've seen, very strong contacts with Macedon since a very, very early age. The same Alexander was son of to an Illyrian princess, so to an Epirotean princess, but there was a very strong Illyrian influence in there, and therefore these troops were very readily available. By the way, the Macedons had also this region in the, I don't remember the name, the one of Heraclea Lynkestis, say in the west towards the Adriatic Sea. Even though at that time the Romans had already set foot into the major Epirot cities on the coast, but say that those were pretty in the hinterland. There was a pretty strong Illyrian presence there. So the once again at Sellasia we have evidence. Even it was a pretty multi-ethnic army. 600 Illyrians fighting for the Macedons, and the interesting thing is that seemingly these weren't really mercenaries proper, but actually an allied contingent. Commanded by the Magyars of Pharos, and so never underestimate here never cut sharp the idea that these were either or allies or mercenaries, because sometimes there was a lot of bargaining, also politically speaking, to send some troops here and there. Mercenaries were all around, but there were still precious resources and manpower, so even these populations living into the Balkanic hinterland were sending sometimes these troops as mercenaries, also for such for political reasons, not just for money, broader strategical schemes. So what else can we say? Philip V sent 400 Illyrians to Crete in 219 BC, and also fielded these 2,000 tralles at Kynoskephali in his army. Now these tralles were Balkanic people, seemingly of Illyrian stock, even if in many books it's actually written that they were Thracians, and at least Livy quite explicitly says that they were Illyrians, so I stick to that. But the even determining who was who in the Balkans was difficult, because in these Danubian areas you had historically Illyrians and Thracians, that by the way are very different even to identify on their own, because besides the fact that we have very few sources about them, they also seemingly came from the same stock. So even this ethnic division sometimes is pretty I don't know how correct it is in the first place. Plus there had been the Getae population. They also were partly seemingly of the Illyrian stock in some measure, but also in there it's very complicated. And there were also a lot of peoples coming from everywhere, also from the steppes, so it's complicated. Now the Celts also arrived in Danube, so it's that messy. Even from a strictly military perspective, you see that there is a huge deal of syncretism in terms of equipment, and since what we are mostly interested in, we don't really care about whether the Tralles were either Thracians or Illyrians. Let's just stick to the fact that they fought into this chiefly light infantry fashion. Even though there were cavalrymen, etc., but also missile troops, etc. And there is another people that is called the Trallianoi that recurs actually into the eastern troops of the successors in Asia, that are sometimes confused with the Tralles, because they're usually called Trallians in English in either way. So sometimes there is a bit of confusion, but there were two quite distinct peoples. It's like when you say about Iberia. Iberia would be the modern Spain and Portugal, while in the ancient world, and it was called in that way, and there is the Caucasian Iberia instead, that existed in the Caucasus, and sometimes people get confused. What's Iberia about that? So always stick to the names and to the sources, especially, because those are the life. There were other groups that, for instance, there were the Penestae that I've never understood whether they were actual tribe or sort of slave class that existed out there, and these are witnessed in the Chalcidican garrison of Cassandreia in 169 BC, as 200 cavalry and 1,000 infantry placed there by Perseus. So passing to the Thracians proper, these were also usually infantrymen. I made a video about Thracian warfare, and I explained in there that essentially the northern Thracians were more sort of cavalrymen, because they were more open to the steppes, to the Scythian steppes, while south of the Danube, so in this area that was closer to Macedon, were also chiefly infantry. But the Thracians actually had pretty good cavalry. We've seen it before with the picked body of 2,000 Thracians under Philip V's army at Cunus Cephalae, and these were probably sent by some I don't know whether by the Audressian Kingdom, I don't remember honestly, but simply were a pretty cohesive contingent, and they also occur pretty often in Antigonid armies as well. In Perseus, in 169 BC, had 3,000 Thracian mercenaries. These were seemingly free bands, and together with them there was actually a contingent commanded by the king of the Audressiae, Cotys. So the Audressian Kingdom was this major, prominent, I don't know how to call it, tribal domain. It was a called kingdom because this essentially was a lineage that was ruling of a clan that was ruling over the others, and it's a major political formation, I think, that ever existed in Thrace, at least in this lower into these later times. By the way, these guys were pretty much Hellenized as well. Thrace had been part of the lands of Lysimachus back in the day, and at this time were still being influenced by Macedon. So the Thracians were actually tribesmen. They were barbarians from the Greek perspective, but they also were pretty much Hellenized, especially in military culture, in equipment, as we were saying before. And they still had pretty strong cavalry. The allied contingent of Cotys seemingly fielded 1,000 elite cavalry, and 1,000 infantry to support them, which also suggests, by the way, that this society was pretty, even in the south, was pretty much about cavalry, in terms also of social organization of the aristocracy and all. And it's very interesting to see here in this area between Thessalia, Macedon, even Paeonia and Thrace, this big deal of emphasis put in on cavalry in local warfare. It's very, very interesting. And finally, there was also an Italic presence in Antigonid armies that was actually pretty exceptional, also for the circumstances for which it occurred. We know that in 198 BC, the Philip V's garrison of Sicyon contained a number of Italic troops. So these were guys that... So we are 198 BC. Basically, the Second Punic War has finished now. So the Romans have once again full control over Italy. So basically, all the Italic warriors that had stuck with Hannibal in revolt against Rome into Italy now fled to Macedon in part. Also, some probably went to Africa together with Hannibal back. But some went to Macedon because Macedon was allied with Hannibal during the Second Punic War. Philip V made this very weird alliance, and it was also pretty weak, telling the truth. So these Italics fled into these closer, either Macedon, the Balkans, either Africa. They were also, protective of their political choice against Roman rule, because the Romans would have slaughtered them if they had come back to Italy. And the others were also deserters from the Roman fleet, as far as we know. So there was this note, let's say, of this presence of even of troops coming from Rome at this point. This is the moment, by the way, to which Rome, a year after, will eventually enter actually in those same years, enter prominently into Macedonian affairs. So invading Greece and defeating the Phalanx and all. So this was also a pretty long video, like yesterday's one, but I hope that I said everything I wanted. So I will reassure you, I will keep talking about this, okay? Not extremely frequently, because I'm more about medieval history now, but these are at least all topics that I want to cover, because they're very, very important, and I think that they're a bit overlooked. Just the other day there was a follower that I want to thank, who complimented me because I was talking about that video about the Seleucid army we were talking about before, relatively to the presence of Syrians, Mesopotamians and Persians into the Seleucid army. And he said, well, nobody talks about this, it's so overlooked. And yeah, it is true. As a matter of fact, it is. And it's a shame, because these powers were actually the guys who ruled the world at the time, and they're awfully neglected. Maybe the name of Macedon recurs. Many people maybe in our world have never heard about the Antigonids as such, but since they associate Alexander with Macedon, so they kind of know that there is Macedon somewhere, that it was a power in. But there are great powers like the Seleucid Empire, for instance, or even Ptolemaic Egypt and other, I don't know, Bactria, that are completely overlooked, and we have necessarily to talk about it, and this is what I'm gonna do. It's gonna take a while, also because these videos, as you understand, are pretty long, and if you want to tell the whole story, you have really to pick every whatever. And I hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you are interested in my upcoming videos. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.